Good evening and welcome, or welcome back, as the case may be. You may be aware that this is the second half of our evening. We've already had a very interesting set of discussions around this book, edited by Michael Triscello and Ajamu Nangwaya, Why Don't the Poor Rise Up? So now we're into the second half of the evening. And thankfully for me, and no doubt for you, I've already done an opening introduction, so you won't hear me sort of ramble on, and we can get straight to the panel. The reason we are starting a little bit late is we had some technical difficulties at the beginning of the evening, and everything sort of got pushed back. But because I'm not going to really be saying anything other than introducing our speakers, hopefully we'll have a good period at the end for discussion. I think there's going to be a lot of people who want to get into the discussion. So before I go on to introduce our speaker for the evening, and then also our four panelists, I just want to say big thanks to SFU Public Square, under whose auspices we are co-organizing this event. It's their Community Summit, which is on the future of work, brave new work, something like 15 events over about a week and a half. Pretty extraordinary. So tremendous thanks to our friends. You are? What's your name?
I can't wait. It's going to be great. Thank you.
Janet Weber.
Thanks for partnering
Completely lost my mind for a second. To Janet and all of her team members, but also Huyam Pham, who's the program assistant at the Institute. I'd also like to thank the Van City Office of Community Engagement. Special thanks to Am Johal there, who does a lot of work with us. We work a lot together. And also the Labour Studies program, another co-sponsor for our event this evening. Just a couple of events that are coming up that I want to draw your attention to. So tomorrow, Dr. Ramzi Baroud and the Palestinian Narrative. That's taking place at 6:30 in room 1700. So get there early. I think it's going to be quite a lot of people for that. And then on March 1st, Robin Maynard is launching a book called Policing Black Lives, and that's going to be 6 p.m. in room 1900 in Harbour Centre, so across the street. And then another thing that the Institute is organizing, a 2-day-long symposium on art, labor, and the future of work. That's going to be happening here in the Centre for Dialogue. I don't think it's in this room, but it's somewhere here in the Centre. Oh, room 470. It starts 9 a.m. on Saturday morning, and it will continue through the day on Saturday and on Sunday. So I think it's going to be quite an exciting set of discussions as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to reintroduce John Clarke, who was speaking on the previous panel, for the benefit of those who've just come for the second half of our evening. John Clarke first became involved in anti-poverty struggles in 1983 when he helped form the Union of Unemployed Workers in London, Ontario. Since 1990, he has worked as an organizer with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, or OCAP. To John are going to be responding. We have four panelists who will be addressing his remarks, and his remarks will be of a critical nature. And we have essentially two sets of respondents. We're going to have both, in a sense, a pro and a contra discussion of basic income. First up is Jenna Van Draanen, who has a PhD and serves on the board of directors of the Basic Income Canada Network and is a member of the executive committee for the Basic Income Earth Network. She's a postdoctoral researcher based at the University of British Columbia and is committed to working towards health, equity, and social justice. Her research looks at the role of poverty in mental health and substance abuse disorders. Next up, really now from the contra side, is Mikhail Roswarski, who's a union researcher, economist based in Vancouver. His writing has appeared in Jacobin, Ricochet, Toronto Star, Briar Patch, and the Globe and Mail, amongst others. He produces the political economy blog, A with a EH, is currently writing a book, The People's Republic of Walmart, with Lee Phillips. Now that's slated for publication with Verso this year. Well, congratulations. It's not mentioned here, but Mikhail is also an associate of the Institute. Pleased to say. And then after Mikhail, we have Trish Garner, who's a provincial organizer for BC PRC, the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition. She is a tea-swilling Brit with a passion for social justice. As a community organizer of BC PRC, a broad-based network of over 400 organizations throughout BC, she focuses on communications, outreach, and community engagement to raise awareness about the root causes of poverty and inequality and how we can collectively tackle them. She has a PhD in gender, sexuality, and women's studies from SFU, very nice, and continues to work on LGBTQ issues. Trish lives with her partner and 3 young children in East Vancouver. And then last but not least, Duane Fontaine is a professional accountant, is currently a PhD student in SFU's interdisciplinary SAR program. He's working with me, I'm pleased to say. He's studying the nature of work in contemporary society and is contrasting it with an examination of alternative visions for the future of work. The widespread application of robotics, automation, and artificial intelligence into the productive economy threatens the future of work. Duane is revisiting the utopian quest for an aesthetic state and how its emancipatory potential, combined with such transitional solutions as basic universal income, might present an opportunity to redefine the very nature and purpose of work in a way that enhances meaning and freedom. So just a quick word about the format before I turn it over to John, who will speak for around 45 minutes, and then we'll hear from the panelists. So John will obviously be followed by the panelists who will give their take on basic income, and after that we'll have 3 questions from the audience, and then it'll come back to John to address the various arguments set forth by the panelists, and then we'll open it up for more audience participation. I really need to make a comment about the need for respectful discussion from the floor. It's really important that if you have a question, you come to the mic, be recognized, and make your intervention. Question or comment, please try and be brief. There are a lot of people here, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to want to speak. And we can all not, it's not possible for us all to speak at the same time. I don't want anybody interrupting others. So when somebody has the floor, please be respectful of them. Okay, this is very important. Other than that, I think we want to have a very fulsome and critical debate with much disagreement, I hope. Dissensus. So without any further ado, I'll turn the floor over to John Clarke. John.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much. Well, I'm enormously pleased to be able to participate in this debate. What is happening with basic income in BC at the moment is of enormous importance. Firstly, of course, because it's going to be a site for a pilot project, but also precisely because that project is going to be organised through an NDP government with the support of the Green Party. There's a very high level of progressive credibility, which, as an opponent of basic income, I don't welcome, but I'm very pleased to be able to raise a voice of opposition here. Perhaps the only comparable situation I could make is to the situation in the UK at the moment, where Scottish pilot projects are being organised and where the Corbyn-led British Labour Party is looking fairly favourably, I think, at the possibility of basic income. And that's of enormous significance. So the social policy commentator John Stapleton in Ontario has referred to basic income as an aspirational policy. And I think that's a fairly apt way of putting it, because advocates for it cover an enormous range of the political spectrum, from right-wing libertarians to radical leftists, and as well, many people focus on particular aspects and functions. There are those who would suggest that basic income would be enormously helpful for disabled people. There are strong feminist arguments advanced for basic income, and there are those who clearly believe that when Elon Musk's robots take over, that a basic income is going to be absolutely essential. What I want to do with what I'm going to say is to look at the thing really from a couple of points of view. First of all, I want to look at the question of how something called basic income might well serve the interests of the neoliberal agenda of enhanced exploitation, austerity and privatisation. And I'll suggest that there are favourable, it's being viewed favourably from that point of view by people with exactly that perspective. And then I'm going to try to assess, not favourably, the prospects for a progressive version of basic income coming into fruition. If we're going to look at the right side, the regressive basic income model, I think it perhaps important just to step back first from the question of basic income and just remind ourselves of some of the features of income support itself in a broader sense. The state has provided a level of income support, I think we could say, as a reluctant concession. There has been a recognition of the fact that absolutely providing nothing risks social unrest and social dislocation. And so a level of income support has been provided at the minimum level necessary to ensure that there isn't social unrest, but also to ensure that not working doesn't appear to be a very good option. That's been the fundamental defining features. The original model is the English Poor Laws. When they dispossessed the peasantry, and they needed to dispossess the peasantry to turn them into waged workers because people were not very happy going into the dark satanic mills if they had a plot of land. After they dispossessed people, they initially, in the 1500s, the Tudor authorities used their capacity for repression to try to simply terrorise people. But that didn't prove to be adequate, so they brought in the Poor Laws. And over a period of a couple of centuries, the thing carried on. And then in the 1830s, they decided to intensify the thing. And the new Poor Laws were introduced, and the defining principle of it was less eligibility. Less eligibility meant that the level of benefits that would be provided to people would be low enough that the lowest paying jobs seemed a better option, but also that they would provide it under conditions that were calculatedly as unpleasant and degrading as they possibly could be, the workhouse. What was implemented was what Piven and Cloud have called rituals of degradation. And I think it's fair to say that to this day, that notion of less eligibility has been a defining feature of public welfare systems. During the post-war period, after the Second World War, there was a relatively high watermark of social provision. Unemployment insurance had been introduced, welfare programs were improved. But if you read something like Ian Adams' book, The Poverty Wall, you must be clear that less eligibility didn't die, that there was still, the systems were still fundamentally inadequate and degrading. You then arrive at the dawn of the neoliberal era. By the 70s, the post-war economic boom had come to an end, and the very concessions that had been made to workers in the form of wages and the social wage had cut into profits. And so a counter-offensive was launched, with perhaps Milton Friedman as the ideological founding father. And the whole idea was to restore the rate of profit. They attacked unions, capital was deregulated, there was movement off to low-wage economies. But one of the really important things they did was they tightened down on income support systems. They degraded them. They made them as inadequate as they possibly could, more inadequate than they'd been in the past. And the results of that, the payoff for that, has been really quite dramatic in terms of creating a low-wage, precarious workforce. In Ontario, as recently as 97, 1 worker in 40 was working for the minimum wage. By 2015, that had gone to 1 worker in 8. So enormously successful attack on the poor by degrading income support systems. Now, at this point, the idea of a basic income is on the table. Amongst the grandees of global capitalism, there is by no means a consensus on the matter. If you try to discuss basic income with Donald Trump, I'm sure his eyes would glaze over. The British Tories are still in full fox hunting mode when it comes to people on social assistance, on social benefits. And the Wall Street Journal believes that basic income is a passport to universal sloth. But I would suggest that the more astute thinkers within the neoliberal order see some real possibilities. And there are a number of possibilities for them, for something called basic income. Firstly, there is the not unimportant question of legitimacy. The World Bank, the IMF, the crowd that gets together at Davos, the Silicon Valley people, a whole bunch of them are very concerned about the inequality that exists, or to be more accurate, they're worried about the anger that the inequality that exists is creating. And the notion of enlightened capitalism has begun to emerge. And so the progressive veneer around a basic income is, I think, for them, a consideration that's important. Particularly the more so since there is a progressive lobby advocating for basic income. The big selling point that's put forward with basic income is less conditionality. And that might at first glance appear to be a problem for the people who've profited so much from degrading income support systems. But in my opinion, it may not be that big of a problem for them to ease up on the conditionality at this particular time, precisely because the poor law, less eligibility-based systems have been so successful in creating a workforce with much less power, a precarious workforce. But it may be that the use of that poor law big stick can be eased up on. In fact, it may even become counterproductive. As you're creating a more just-in-time, on-call, elastic workforce, a petty, bloody-minded system that looks to cut people off and render them destitute at every moment may in fact become counterproductive. So some easing up on conditionality is something that I think they may be interested in granting. If you look at the Ontario pilot project, and we've looked at it in some detail, I think it constitutes a kind of a checklist, a neoliberal checklist for how a basic income system could be produced that would serve the purposes of the neoliberal agenda. The benefit levels that are provided under the pilot, while they are significantly higher than the absolutely derisory social assistance levels, are still sub-poverty payments. They're set at about 75% of the low-income measure. So this is not a payment that is looking to end the tyranny of the job market. It's not going to provide what Philippe Van Parijs has described as the capitalist road to communism. This is still a very, very modest payment. And if the robot future comes and all you've got is what the Ontario government is providing, then you're not going to be in particularly good shape. I saw a little cartoon going around the other day where they had a little stick person saying, "Damn, a robot took my job. Now I'm going to have to look for another way of feeding myself." And then the second one said, "Yay, a robot took my job. I've got basic income. Now I can do something important with my life." And that's clearly not what's coming out of the Ontario pilot. Also, while there is significantly reduced conditionality, it is still targeted to the poor. It is not a universal system, and it is a means-tested system, and they still claw back your income. Very interestingly and very importantly, 70% of the people that they're looking to recruit, and they've only recruited so far about 2,500 out of the 4,000 they're looking for, but some 70% of the people are not going to be drawn from the social assistance roles. So what they're looking at primarily is a model for a wage top-up. And a wage top-up is only, I think, a polite way of saying a subsidy to low-paying employers. So that's a really important element of the thing, and I'm going to return to that in due course. Now, if you take a really hardcore right-wing basic income advocate like the right-wing US political scientist Charles Murray, and the Fraser Institute has said much the same thing, the really defining feature of basic income for them is that what is provided must not augment existing systems of social provision, it must replace them. And that's perhaps the hallmark of the right-wing basic income approach. And while we're only talking about a small experiment in Ontario, I think with regards to that issue, the writing is already on the wall. People on social assistance who go onto the programme will lose the supports and referrals that they previously had. They will be expected to use, the term is used, self-navigate. On top of that, they will lose the protection that they formerly had from debt collectors. There was a woman in Thunder Bay who went on to the pilot and immediately had her basic income payment garnished. She lost all her money for the month, and the only remedy they could do was to put her back onto disability benefits. Special diet money that people get will no longer exist. Medical transportation money that was given to people will no longer be granted. And mobility devices, the support for that will be taken away. What that means, I think, is that there is a significant section of the disabled population with high support needs who it will not be to their advantage to go on to even this relatively generous pilot project. And that's very dangerous, because at the end of the day, when an assessment is made, that segment of the population will not be assessed. So of enormous significance. I think there's another important potential regressive benefit for basic income that we should pay due attention to. And that is how it could be used, and I'm not suggesting that everyone who advocates it wishes this, but it could be used to close the door further on immigrants and non-status people. A.J. Withers and Yogi Acharya from OCAP have written a piece on the basic income lobby and its weakness when it comes to provision for immigrants and non-status people. The Italian advocates of basic income are correspondingly very anti-immigrant. In the UK, the really quite shameful term to describe basic income is called citizens' income, which is being used, which is a term that makes me shudder, actually, when you think about the present global context. To be advocating a form of income support and calling it citizens' income is quite dreadful. Now, having sort of tried to suggest that basic income could certainly be used by the political right and by the neoliberal agenda, I'm very aware of the fact that there are going to be in this room people who, with great sincerity, believe that basic income could be used in a progressive direction. And some of you are going to be saying to yourselves, yes, that could be true, there could be some of these dangers, but that's not what I have in mind. That's not the form of basic income that I'm looking at. So I want to try and respond to that. And I do have to say that progressive opponents of basic income have sometimes been a little too vehement, sometimes a little too sarcastic, and I don't want to fall into that trap. But I do have to say, without trying to be offensive and without trying to be sarcastic, that basic income isn't like a form of online shopping, where you scroll down and you pick out the version and then you get it delivered. If you're going to assess what is likely to happen, then you actually have to start looking at the context, the present context, the neoliberal agenda, the balance of forces that exists in society. You're going to have to start thinking about possibilities, because, to be quite honest, I've seen many, many versions of a progressive basic income put forward. And the common feature that I find is that they're very, very big on explaining the benefits, but not as good at actually assessing the practical possibilities, the obstacles, and what stands in their way. Progressive advocates of basic income also, I think, very often make the mistake of not drawing the line clearly against the neoliberal versions, of presenting them as flawed but important first step forwards. And that's, I think, a profound mistake. Guy Standing from the Basic Income Earth Network is very cheerful to admit that he worked with the Finnish government and Hugh Segal in Ontario on how things could be organised. Quebec has just come up with this travesty of something that they're calling a basic income system, which is to take a section of the disabled population who they are prepared to deem unlikely to be able to find work and give them a relatively secure income and call that basic income, and obviously really put the boots to everybody else. I mean, there's absolutely the whole purpose is quite clear to take a small section of the population and give them something, and then hammer everybody else with conditionality, work assessments, and all kinds of stuff. And yet, while the Basic Income Earth Network has distanced itself from that, I've seen several advocates for basic income in Quebec say the same thing, that it's not perfect, but we're moving in the right direction. We are indeed moving in the right direction. There's the other problem that I think, and it's perhaps connected, is that the basic income lobby places a little too much faith in the lion lying down with the lamb. The slogan, you may have seen it, that goes around, that is often used, is that basic income is neither left nor right but forward. I mean, that makes me cringe. I think that's just such a terrible thing to say. There's this perennial notion that the 1% is finally waking up and that they see the need for basic income and that Silicon Valley is getting behind it. And somebody a little while ago sent me this thing, so I suppose he was boasting, but he has this picture of the head of Deutsche Telekom advocating basic income, and I had to reply, I'm sorry, chum, but if I was you, that isn't something I'd be boasting about. So that's I think a big mistake. The other problem, I think, with the whole question of evaluating the possibilities of basic income on the progressive left is that too much emphasis is placed on the pilot projects. Because, to be honest, I don't think they really prove that much. To assess basic income, you've got to assess the impact that it's going to have on a major political jurisdiction and on an economy. It doesn't really cut it to take a couple of thousand poor people and give them a bit more money. Because what you're really doing is not studying basic income, you're studying poor people. I'll be prepared to concede right now that if you take 2,000 poor people and give them a bit more money, they're going to be a bit better off. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And I think it just falls back on the old moralising stuff. If we give the poor more money, will they spend it on the demon drink, or will they move to the suburbs and have 2.3 children and a dog named Spot? I think that's the sort of the problem that's existing with that approach. And then I think we also have to recognise that many progressive advocates of basic income are buying into settling for something much less than a universal basic income. Guy Caron, when he was running for the leadership of the NDP, was focused on the notion of doing something about the 70% of people who are poor, who are waged. No less a figure than John McDonnell, Corbyn ally, Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain, recently went to Davos. And he said some really quite great and defiant things to the grandees of global capitalism in the Swiss Alps. But when it came to basic income, what he was really acknowledging was that it was about topping up low-wage precarious workers' money. And he sort of suggested that the global capitalists were going to have to chip in on it. But I think that's making your peace, frankly, with the neoliberal agenda. I think that's saying that low-wage precarious work is the fact of life in this day and age, and we're going to have to accept it. And all we can do is divert some tax money over to make it a bit better. The BC Greens, in a background paper to their election platform, actually say this. They say there is a significant gap between minimum wage and livable income. This approach is designed to protect marginal jobs. The long-term intent is that basic income would fill the gap between minimum wage and a livable income. And I just think that's entirely the wrong approach. I don't think we should be accepting that all we can do is top up low-wage work. And I think it's particularly unfortunate to be doing it at a time when the fight for 15 has gathered so much momentum, when the McDonald's workers in the UK have taken on their employer, when Amazon workers in various parts of Europe are fighting back. To say that precarious low-wage work is just an inevitability part of this day and age is wrong. We've got to challenge it, we've got to fight it, and we've got to make sure that employers pay living wages to people and not sub-poverty wages. So now let me just look at universal basic income itself. If we're talking about not compromises, but we're talking about the notion of a real universal basic income. That means a universal, unconditional and adequate payment that is provided to people as a matter of right. And that's certainly what I think the Basic Income Earth Network would argue is the ultimate goal. That means adequacy, and it means as well that it's not paid for by cutting other vital systems of social provision. I'd have to say that sounds wonderful, but in my honest opinion, it is simply not possible in a capitalist society to bring in such a system, to introduce such a system. If you provided everyone with an adequate income before they considered the question of what relationship they were going to have with the job market, you are removing economic coercion. And that, after 40 years of neoliberalism, would be an incredible change in the balance of forces. And I don't believe that we're anywhere close to being able to put that into, into effect. Pam Frake from the Workers' Action Centre in Toronto formulated it this way. She said that what you're really saying with that is that you are expecting the state to provide the working class with an unlimited strike fund. And that really isn't going to happen. The reason they took the land away from the peasants was so they would have to go to work. Now the idea is that you're going to give it back in the form of cash. You're going to give the land back to the peasants in the form of cash, in the form of this adequate cash payment that's secure. And I just don't think that that's at all a realistic possibility. Now, something strikes me here. Let me lay my political cards on the table and say that I'm not very solicitous for the well-being of the capitalist system. It's not that I'm worried that capitalism might be disrupted and there could be problems. I'm just saying that I don't believe it's possible. That if we're going to actually get rid of capitalism, it's not going to die a death of social policy. We're actually going to have to challenge it in much more serious ways, and there isn't a social policy end run around that. Now, when I participated in a debate organised by the LEAP Manifesto in Toronto on basic income, I was heckled. And I wasn't offended because I've done a fair bit of that myself, but this man shouted out from the back of the room. He said, "Then propose something." And I sort of realised at that moment when I heard him say that given that he had accepted the notion that it was going to be possible to provide everyone with an adequate amount of money they could live on quite well before they decided if they wanted to consider the job market, I realised that I can't match that. To try to talk about the realities, it's like trying to have a discussion about the aging process with someone who believes in the fountain of youth. It's just not a realistic conversation. But as I've tried to point out, there just is not a just, humane form of post-capitalist capitalism. It just doesn't exist. And so I think we have to deal with the actual harsh realities that we're facing 40 years into a neoliberal agenda. We've been weakened. Our unions are weakened. Our social movements are not strong. Many political parties that once advanced progressive agendas have bought into the austerity consensus. We're not where we were. But if we're going to go on the offensive, if we're actually going to fight back, then we're going to have to look at ways in which we can realistically and meaningfully fight back. And I don't believe that arguing for a cash payment that makes us shoppers in the neoliberal marketplace is really the best way to go. I just refer to this paper that was written by Armin Yalnizan from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And she said something in there that I think is quite important. She's talking about how public services could be strengthened. And is it the best thing to just give people a cash payment? And she says this, the CCPA alternative federal budget shows that for half the annual cost of a poverty-eliminating basic income, 15 billion, we could permanently expand the stock of affordable housing, childcare and public transit, as well as eliminate user costs for pharmacare, dental care and post-secondary schooling. And she continues, but I won't elaborate. But I think that's absolutely right. John McDonnell, again, not that I want to take too many hits at John McDonnell, I rather admire the man, to be honest, but given his advocacy for basic income, he has spoken about the possibility that a Corbyn-led Labour government could actually exceed the reform agenda of the Clement Attlee government of 1945, the one that put the National Health Service in place, etc. And then he talks about basic income. But the spirit of 45 built council homes. It created schools. It created hospitals. It didn't give everybody this cash payment thing. And I think that's something that John McDonnell should perhaps consider. And it's something I hope the British Labour Party considers very, very seriously. If we're going to fight for things, then let's fight for free, expanded, accessible public services. Let's actually fight to create a situation where social housing is not something that exists not even for the poorest people, but becomes part of mainstream working class life. We do have to fight on income support programs as well. Let's fight for income support programs that are based on full entitlement, adequate income, and let's challenge all the bureaucratic intrusion and moral policing that's built into the present system and fight for real supports. And then there's the question of technological displacement, which I think is more nuanced than many suggest, but it's still a very real consideration. I don't think it's realistic to think that in a capitalist society, I don't care what Elon Musk or Richard Branson or Mark Zuckerberg tells you, I don't think it's realistic to think that they're going to set aside a portion of their profits to justly and humanely deal with those that they technologically displace. I mean, for God's sake, these are people who are building pipelines to transport dirty oil as the planet is frying. You think they're going to worry about being reasonable and fair to people that they lay off with robots? That's just simply not going to happen. But that doesn't mean that a workless future in which people are simply abandoned is inevitable. The struggle decides that question. Right now in Germany, workers have taken up a fight and they've won successes for a 28-hour work week. And that's of much more significance for the German working class than the endorsement of basic income by the head of Deutsche Telekom. So I think we have to recognise that there isn't a policy end run around neoliberal reality. If we're going to make this society better, then we're going to have to transform it ourselves. I think the truth is that neoliberalism and its agenda is not being softened. It's being intensified, it's being deepened, and they're regrouping. And I think basic income is emerging as one of their weapons. I think it is a profound mistake for the left to lay down a welcome mat for that. I think we should be fighting it. I think we should be rejecting it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, John, for a tremendously provocative lecture, and I'm sure we're going to have an interesting debate to follow. I have to say that it really is a tremendous privilege to have you here, John. People like me, we teach courses that end up discussing organic intellectuals, Gramsci and Western Marxism, but here we have an organic intellectual. So that was really a wonderful talk. So I'll turn it over to Jenna.
Thank you. So I think that many of us on the left are conditional in our support for a basic income, which I find delightfully ironic. And it's true. It depends on what you mean by a basic income. So to be clear about what the Basic Income Canada Network means by a basic income, before I start my remarks, I'll say we're talking about an income that ensures everyone has sufficient income to meet their basic needs, to live with dignity, and that is provided regardless of their work status. We mean an income that's in line with our principles, things like universality, autonomy, equality. We mean an income that replaces paternalistic income security programs, but not existing social services, and in fact works well with complementary social policies to create a strong social safety net. So if I'm understanding John Clarke and the position on the left that he's advocating for, I think that the fear and objection that we've heard to a basic income tonight is not necessarily a fear and rejection of the social policy itself, not the one that I am advocating for, but rather a belief that the neoliberal government will implement it in a way that does more harm than good. And to quote OCAP's position statement, which John actually already did, we must struggle for income support systems that are based on adequacy, full entitlement, and that are purged of rules and moral policing. And this is exactly the kind of income guarantee that I'm advancing. But I do not see basic income as a standalone solution. I don't see basic income and the class struggle that John was just speaking about as an either-or scenario. I think that a strong basic income must exist within a framework of workplace legislation, one that allows, protects, and encourages unionization, that guarantees a living wage, and that gives people real agency when they're engaging with the labor market. The problem with relying only on work-oriented reforms to end poverty and overthrow capitalism is that this model has historically left many of us behind. Those who are not employed, racial and ethnic minorities, and women in particular, have not fared as well in these movements. And work-oriented reforms are designed to help those who are employed. So I think that advancing a more broad-based set of rights through a guaranteed income in addition to work-oriented reforms offers us the capacity to recognize the inequalities that exist in our unemployment statistics right now, all of the unpaid and underpaid work that's currently being done, and also gives us the ability to question what work is worthwhile, particularly from a social and environmental perspective. I think that it gives us all a floor to stand on rather than a social safety net to fall into. I do share John's concern that a poorly designed basic income could be problematic. However, I have a different conclusion. I think that not pushing for a progressive basic income is synonymous with giving up preemptively on a policy change that could dramatically improve our society. And I think that's exactly what a neoliberal government would want us to do. I'll say that many other fundamental changes to fundamental human rights were met with resistance and fears of impossibility, but I think without this kind of courage and social pressure to fight for something new, we might not have universal health care in Canada, for example. What if, back in 1947, Tommy Douglas had held back on his advocacy for a universal healthcare system in Canada because of a fear that the government would implement it, for example, without prescription drug coverage or without dental care? The country we live in today might be a very different place. Now, as a public health researcher, would I prefer a more equitable system of healthcare in Canada? Absolutely. But if given the option between a privatized version and the one we have today, I would take the one we have today any day. So I propose that we not allow a fear like this to get in the way of advocating for a change that could be transformative. And now I'm going to tell you why. So first of all, basic income is a dramatic improvement to our current income security system. There's more policing and judgment and conditionality in these systems than there ever has been before. Our income assistance programs in BC include multiple conditions that many of you probably know very well, like a work search requirement, a 2-year independence requirement, a depletion of savings, and that's all before you're even eligible. I believe that a basic income would eliminate the social stigma and these paternalistic conditions that are attached to our welfare programs right now for the 1.8 million Canadians that rely on them. I believe that basic income would also increase bargaining power for low-wage workers, and I think that it would do this by allowing them to decline jobs that are exploitative, and also by allowing for more discernment in job choice. I think it would allow workers to fight freely for fair wages, and also for better working conditions, and I think it would allow us all to decide which companies are worth our time and which are not. I think it would allow us to pursue meaningful work that's also beneficial to society. Like this. I forgot to advance the slide. So the second reason is that basic income is evidence-based. The income guarantee model that was tested in Canada and Manitoba in the 1970s showed dramatic results. Mental and physical health improved. We saw an 8.5% decrease in hospitalizations. There was increased social support and and improved education outcomes compared to the control group. And we all benefit from the security provided by a guarantee that no matter what happens in your life, your income's not going to fall below the poverty line. We already have a system that operates much like a basic income right now in Canada for children and for seniors. And we have evidence that these systems work better than what otherwise might be in place to improve mental health and food security, for example. And these are not aspirational social policies, these are things that already exist. So we know that this is something that could work. And the third reason is the future. So I see this as a policy that's prepared to meet the needs of our changing labor markets. I don't think we know what kind of precarity the next several decades are going to bring to workers. Estimates from the Brookfield Institute suggest that 42% of jobs in Canada could be automated using technology we already have. And this is projected to grow at faster and faster rates. I don't know about all of you, but as someone who has many working years left in her life, I do not feel confident with the current systems and with advancing our current model of welfare to meet the needs of this rapidly changing future. So, I've been spending my spare time volunteering on the board of directors for the Basic Income Canada Network for the last 7 years, not because I believe that basic income is a silver bullet or one-stop fits-all shop, but because I believe it's the best shot we have at improving our income security programs in a way that restores dignity and autonomy to those in the most precarious positions. Coupled with a strong minimum wage and affordable housing policy and robust social services, I think this is a way that we can all achieve security, stability, and dignity in our futures, whatever that future brings. And I think it's time for those of us concerned with the depth and breadth of poverty in Canada to stop fighting for meager improvements within a flawed system and to start advancing the ideal progressive version of the country that we want to live in. And so do many others. These are just some of the organizations that have endorsed basic income in Canada. So please, if you are interested, join the push and the conversation about a basic income. This is for all of us, and we're stronger together.
Thank you very much.
Sitting next to John, I was told beforehand by Samir not to echo or agree too much. with John's comments, and I can only promise on one of those things. I'll try not to echo, but I have to say I found the case quite compelling, so I will likely fail pretty badly on the agreeing bit. Maybe I'll just take, I wrote some things down because I'm bad at talking on the spot, but I think there were a couple of things that John brought out that I think were important. I think an important thing was this sort of two very broad ways of looking at basic income at this particular juncture, and sort of separating the abstract debate about basic income as a political idea from basic income as sort of a concrete political demand. I think on the abstract side, to a certain degree, I think what John was saying is that, you know, the question for the left, at least, putting aside the right-wing sort of version of basic income, can be boiled down to whether basic income can be thought of as what Andre Gortz famously called a non-reformist reform. So that's a reform within the current system that nevertheless simultaneously weakens the hand of capital and strengthens the perspective for sort of more thoroughgoing change. I mean, I think John made a compelling case that there's versions of basic income, those coming from the right, that are not even, you know, reformist reforms, but just entrenchments of the sort of neoliberal status quo. And I think that's visible in many of the experiments in Finland, in India, and in Ontario, certainly, as John pointed out. But I think he was trying to make the stronger case that even the left versions of basic income don't fulfill the criteria for non-reformist reforms, and that while resulting in material improvements, they expand the role of the market as the place where sort of social provisioning happens. And I mean, I think this was the quote from Armin Yalnizyan was helpful in drawing that out. And I think the contrast that's been made across the table, you know, with something like public health care or pharmacare, which at least takes, you know, a part of life off of the market and subjects it, at least potentially, to democratic decision making. Not whether that actually happens in practice is a different question. And I mean, even on a sort of tactical level, I mean, I think the fight for something like public health care is one where you can, you know, exploit sort of divisions within the capitalist class. There's to get something that actually does get workers something more than just, you know, a slightly bigger check. You know, you can see that in the U.S., where it's basically the insurance and the finance industries that are taxing the rest of the corporate sector for healthcare and resulting in an unhealthy workforce. And there's space to sort of to use those divisions to win something. And something that, you know, even as it loosens the grip of the financial sector on the major part of the economy, it decommodifies an important service, remains something around which to build social solidarity, and is harder to take away, because in a way the sort of rich benefit from it too. That, you know, there's even people in that top 10% or 1%, maybe not the top, you know, 0.1%. Have a fear of, you know, of winding up paying, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars in drug costs or something like that, being uninsured, which makes public health care something that's very hard to dislodge, whereas we've seen with welfare systems, which are, you know, highly targeted and means tested, it's very easy to freeze welfare rates for a decade or cut them because they don't have this kind of broad thoroughgoing support. And basic income at a truly universal level, you know, that $10,000 won't have that same import to a member of that top 10 or 1% as does, say, public health care or public pharmacare, which potentially could make a much bigger difference in their lives. I'll skip ahead a little bit. I think the real value, I mean, it's easy to play sort of armchair revolutionaries with ideas and pit sort of, you know, abstract ideas against each other. I think the real value of John's critique is that it looks at basic income not just as an abstract idea, but as a concrete political demand, and one that is being slowly translated into practice here and there. I think he's right that the current fashion for pilot projects has more to do with public relations than any sort of serious study of the issue. You know, I think we already, as John pointed out, we already know that if you give poor people more money, they'll be less poor. And that's, it isn't rocket science, or it's not even rocket sociology to figure this out. However, on the flip side, I think money actually, and not in the pocket, of one person, but in the aggregate, is often the one thing missing from the debates around many real-life basic income proposals, and missing from basic income as a political demand. Conservative estimates have put the price tag on a minimum income version of basic income, which only brings those who don't currently have enough income to the poverty line. So it's not an actual universal basic income, but one that just brings everyone who isn't yet there to some standard of adequacy. Put that at $30 billion candle-wide for an income-tested model that keeps existing programs intact and brings say eliminates poverty completely in terms of a low-income measure. A real universal basic income that gives money to every person regardless of their income is literally a cost in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and equivalent to 20%, something like almost 20% of GDP if it's set at a measly $10,000 per person, or closer to 30 or more percent of GDP annually if it's set around the poverty line or a bit above. And I mean, you can eliminate redundant supports like EI and say that you'll have savings from healthier people and safer communities, and I think that's true. But I mean, even all of those will just make a dent in this sum. And I mean, I take the point that radical social change being expensive is never a reason to stop pursuing it. But I think at the same time, many debates about basic income sort of happen in a vacuum that don't take account these facts. And I mean, I think you end up like the person, with the fountain of, selling you the fountain of youth a little bit. And I mean, I think it's useful to take that and sort of just put it a little backwards. Sort of imagine if the working class, labor, and the poor had the social power to extract a redistribution of 30 or more percent of society's resources, not just amongst themselves, but necessarily from the rich and powerful, then what else would we have the social power to do? If we had the power even approaching implementing this goal, could we guarantee, we could do a lot more, which I think John was getting at. But I want to end, and it's not just that we could do a lot more, but I think what John mentioned, we could necessarily, it would mean doing something that completely eliminates the economic coercion that's at the heart of the system, right? That says to every worker who demands more, the boss can come and say, there's someone waiting in line to replace you. To what John has said, that, that the poor, even people who do unwaged work, like women, like lots of other people, fulfill an important role in capitalism, that they do all this social provisioning that has to be there so that capitalists can take a profit out of the production that happens on the market. And I want to end on saying two things. Sorry, I know I have to wrap, but there's a couple things that I think, another thing that gets lost in the debate is just the thoughts about automation. I mean, we hear these statistics about 40% or 50% of jobs being automated. I mean, I have a whole folder of scans on my computer of headlines dating back to the early 19th century, late 18th century that say, spinning jennies are going to take all our jobs and we'll all be destitute. And then it becomes, the steam engine, and then becomes that. So I think capitalists have always found interesting new ways to exploit us, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. But I do think that I want to end on a very conciliatory note, because I think John's right, and it's not good to sort of pit these projects and demands against each other in a very abstract way. I think it's right to bring things back to sort of the terrain of social struggle, but it's also, and I think it's right that on this terrain, the progressive vision of basic income just isn't on offer. We're fighting defensive battles, and that's where we are, and that's where we're building. But I think we also have a common vision. Like, I have a vision. I think we all want a basic income of sorts. I I think, we want an economy that's arranged according to human needs rather than according to capitalist capacity to profit. And we don't want a market for everything. And we do want a democratic and solidaristic voice over the economy. So in a sense, I also want a basic income. I just don't think that this model of a market-based payment is viable today and possible in this world, like John did.
Thank you, Mikhail. Excellent. And now we turn the floor over to Trish Garner.
Can you line up the video I had queued up? Just pause it for a second. Is it still there?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. I'll let you know when to start.
Oh, there we go.
So I'm Trish Garner with the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition. And as Samir said, we're a coalition of about 400 organizations throughout the province. We have no official position on basic income because we have members who are very strong supporters and we have members who are very strong critics, and we have many people who are on the fence, undetermined. But what we do have is about 10 years calling for a poverty reduction plan for BC, with many elements, 7 key pillars within that: housing, childcare, healthcare, education, and more. And finally, we have a government that's making some steps towards a plan here in BC, being the last province without that. I agree with John that it's critical to look at the context within which this kind of social policy would be brought in. So what I'm going to really focus on is looking at how that plays out in BC. What is the context of poverty that we're living with right now? So we have about 678,000 people in poverty in BC, about 190,000 on income supports. We have 1 in 5 children in poverty. We have a huge gap between rich and poor, increasing inequality in BC. We just had the BC budgets announced last week, today, on this day last week, and we didn't see any increase in our income support rates. We had an increase when the NDP first came in, back in September, of $100 after it was frozen for 10 years, but no increase in this most recent budget. So what we're sitting at is a welfare rate of $710 a month, which is about 40% of the poverty line. So this is deep, deep poverty that we are maintaining here in BC. And our NDP government have made no moves to change that so far. It's also, as John said, it's a very inaccessible system and becoming increasingly more inaccessible. And so I want to show this video quickly, which will bring that to life for us.
They said I wasn't sick enough. But had they taken into consideration all of the other things too, like the arthritis in the hands and the knees, and all of the other conditions, that I broke my back, so like I have problems walking and sitting and standing. The whole picture says, okay, this guy here's a mess, But it's like they picked out one sentence in a book and said, okay, well that sentence is not good enough to publish. And then last year, at the end of May, I had heart failure. So my doctor says, she called him up and she said, no, he's applying, and he's applying for full disability. Just to get on the system, okay? You have to call. You have to call the office. You call the office and you're put on hold for 45 minutes. And you can time it, it's going to be 45 minutes. And the first 3 times that I called, at around the 44 minute, the telephone hangs up, so you've got to call back. But most people have a pay for by the minute. So people go to the free phones. But the free phones, you've got a 5-minute waiting, because there's about 20 people behind you. So you can't even call the office to get the paper. It's wow. And just to get the application, you got to fill out a 94-page form. That's just to get the application. And it's got to be done online. So it took about 2 months to get all the paperwork and everything together. Then I had to go see 2 specialists. They filled out the papers and said, there's no way that this guy can work. There's no way. But it's been over a year now, and I'm still not approved. Well, about 3 months ago, they called me up and they said that they haven't received anything from the doctors. And I said, that's not true. I was there in the office when he sent it to you electronically. So I brought the hard copies down to their office. They said, oh, these are no longer valid because it's over 6 months. I said, it's over 6 months because you people say that you haven't. So I have to start all over again. If somebody didn't have the advantages that I had, I don't know how they can navigate the system. It's set up so that you can't. So the moral of the story is don't get sick.
So this this isn't just a one-off story. About 90% of applicants get rejected. And that's of those who are captured in the statistics, because there are many more discouraged before they even get through all the steps. It's a really inhumane system. And I know that that is one of the reasons that people think, yay, basic income could solve these accessibility issues. But to go from this kind of system to that is a huge, huge leap, and I'm not sure we can make that. We need a radical restructuring of the welfare system, and we're nowhere near there. There's this principle in systems thinking that says the system is perfectly designed for the outcomes it is getting. Mm-hmm. So these are the outcomes we are getting, and this is a system perfectly designed for them. And we are getting increasing homelessness, and we are getting increasing poverty. And that is a system that is perpetuating that. So we need this radical restructuring, but yet we saw in the BC budget no increase in the welfare rates, and also only about $6 million to address accessibility issues, which will contribute to some increased staffing, but not enough to make the changes that we need, to be a human rights kind of approach, to treat people with dignity, to go back to individual caseworkers, these kind of approaches. $6 million for those issues. $4 million was set aside for a basic income conversation. We don't actually know what it's going to look like in BC. I think the government's moving away from a pilot project to more of a modeling approach. So this could be potentially $4 million on modeling, only $6 million to radically restructure a really broken welfare system. And then thinking about the low wage subsidy issue, we've also gone through a consultation process, and we're in the middle of one on minimum wage here in BC. So the Fair Wages Commission has been going around the province and getting our thoughts on increasing the minimum wage. And the first report came back, and the government took on its recommendations about a week before the budget to increase the minimum wage to $15, which is great, but not until 2021. So a very long timeline. So leaving low-wage workers in poverty for many more years. Significantly slower timeline than Ontario, than Alberta, 2 years longer than those other provinces. The next stage in the Fair Wages Commission is to investigate how to fill that gap between minimum wage and living wage, as John outlined, reading out the Greens platform. So there's a concern that basic income will be used to fill that gap. What we will be encouraging, and you yourselves can participate in the Fair Wages Commission, you can send emails, you can go to the consultation process. I know we're all feeling over-consulted, but you can. And you can say, actually, we'd like to fill that gap with universal social services. That is a way. We could actually, the living wage here in Vancouver is $20 an hour, roughly. Our minimum wage is $11 an hour, going to go up to $15. The way that we could reduce that living wage, if we had a universal childcare program, it would bring it down by about $4 or $5. So that is a way to decrease the gap without subsidizing bad employers. So there's lots we can do on the Fight for 15. There's lots we can do on the Living Wage for Families campaign, which is going strong in BC. We have 100 and more living wage employers to come. Just to wrap up, I actually just got sent this report from the UK, which actually makes me more excited than the basic income. Thanks, Sherry, for sharing it. It's to counter the universal basic income. It's a report on universal basic services. And so this is coming from the UK, and it would be providing free, what they've modeled is providing free housing, free food, free transport, and free information access, phone and internet for those in need. And it would only cost just over 2% of UK's GDP, and would make just much more of a significant difference to people in poverty, and would avoid those issues of just perpetuating the market system and playing into those dangers and concerns. Thank you.
I really hate being the bad guy, but we can definitely come back to more discussion of what's going on here in BC. I do want to make sure that we have enough time for discussion. So thank you very much, Trish. Last but not least, Duane Fontaine.
Okay, so I want to address three main discussion points on my argument why basic income is a solution that I think is worth pursuing. First of all, whether or not jobs will be lost. I'm going to touch briefly on the empirical. We've talked about it a little bit. And then I'm going to bring in a deductive argument that you might want to think about. Whether or not a continued reliance on the current system, which relies on economic growth, is wise from an ecological perspective, so that comes into play. And also whether any particular progressive solution contains the seeds of a long-term trend towards emancipation. So on the questions of jobs and whether they'll be lost in the future, again, we've already talked about some of these issues, but a few studies from the Bank of England, PricewaterhouseCoopers, the OECD, and particularly an interesting study out of Oxford University, all showed net declines in jobs in the next 2 to 3 decades. And the Oxford University report in particular showed some very severe declines. So the main counter-argument to that, though, coming from some in the economics profession, is that we've seen previous waves of technological advance in history, and we've also seen that they have indeed led to job losses and displacements, but ultimately those jobs have been replaced in other areas, other industries, even new professions and trades. And so this, again, may prove to be true. However, the rebuttal to this states that this time just might be different. And it might be different due to the very nature of the technologies we're dealing with, robotics, artificial intelligence, and the latest computer technology. So previous technological advances took over a particular element, I think, of human capability by performing these tasks more efficiently. However, in the past, there was always a residual set of human capabilities that we were able to draw upon to power and to feed new jobs as the basis for job growth. Again, today's computers offer computing power and speed that we can't match. Artificial intelligence, with its ability to learn, to recursively self-program, is now challenging our abilities to even think creatively and solve problems. And robotics is now capable of feats of manual dexterity that surpass ours in many ways. So it is quite possible, I believe, that we are witnessing the beginning of an era where we no longer offer unique and irreplaceable capabilities to serve for new employment growth. The next question I want to address is the reliance on economic growth. So if we assume that the way forward is to continue to pursue the logic of growth economics to create jobs, and furthermore, if we were to assume that our progressive strategies should strive to work within that system, then we have this ecological issue to contend with. Economic growth requires a steady increase in material and energy inputs. And so while we've had some success in decoupling our economic growth from those inputs, that's come on a relative basis. On an absolute basis, we're actually no further ahead. Declines in goods and services gained through the greater production efficiency lead to higher consumption of other, newer goods and services. This is known as the Jevons paradox. Furthermore, we know that economic growth also produces greater negative externalities, such as pollution, climate change, and the carbon emissions associated with that, and biodiversity loss. My last point relates to the emancipatory potential of BI. So progressive solutions that ignore the ecological component, as I said, are not sustainable, but solutions that rely solely on the transformative power of a politically conscious working class might just be doomed to failure as well. Union membership and influence has been greatly diminished, as John has hinted at, since the 70s. Furthermore, union membership, I believe, does not in and of itself guarantee a progressive outlook and the more expansive social concern that entails. Many of the BI pilot projects that have been conducted so far have showed that there was a small but not insignificant group of individuals that permanently exited the job market. When we combine that with the group of people willing to perhaps move from full-time to part-time work because of their BI income, we could well see a movement towards a shorter work week, as John Maynard Keynes promised back in the 30s. More free time does not have to equate to more consumptive leisure time as well, too, which on its own, like I said, might be no better in terms of consumption. It could equal more time to engage as citizens and expand the range of democratic action and participation. It could equal more time to pursue life-enhancing education. And so this has the potential to provide people with a greater sense of meaning in their lives. This is in itself may offer an alternative to consumerism and the endless growth that consumerism requires. Emancipatory arguments for BI or any other policy for that matter are often subject to the criticism that they are impractical and they're politically infeasible. However, criticisms of the utopian and normative aspects of BI, I think, run counter to the traditional goals of a progressive vision for society, one that seeks greater freedom at work and from work. This is the freedom ultimately to choose work that is self-directed and non-alienated. So I feel strongly that progressives need to take back the banner of freedom that the right has so successfully co-opted. The progressive vision of freedom, one which incorporates both positive and negative freedoms, is the more complete one. And I believe that a well-designed progressive BI enables both of these freedoms to be expressed. The freedom gained from not having to worry about providing for basic necessities might open up higher freedoms, such as the ability to add an aesthetic dimension to life. And by this I mean the freedom to pursue personal creativity and expression, the freedom to pursue community involvement, and the freedom to become more engaged as citizens.
Thank you very much, Duane. Well, this has just been a remarkable panel, a wonderful lecture, and then 4 terrific responses. So, as promised, I'll take 3 questions from the audience. Yes, and then we'll go back to John to respond to each of the panelists. So please, if you'd like to come up to the microphone, if you can. If you're unable to, you can just ask your question from where you are.
Okay, yeah.
So here, and in the back.
Okay, so basically my question...
Try and be brief.
Okay, my question basically is, what do you think are the chances that if a basic income were implemented that actually guaranteed people $30,000 of income, what are the chances that this could lead to hyperinflation as the capitalists try to claw back what workers had gained?
Okay, thank you. Other question?
Are we just asking?
Yeah, we could take 3 and then responses, and then go back to John. Yeah.
Okay. I'm Maria. I'm a local organizer here for women's poverty. I'm wondering, as a feminist and anti-capitalist, I am taught to ask for 100% of what I want. So I do fight for a guaranteed livable income with all these principles attached, so a progressive basic income, you might call it. But what I want to know is, how do you contend with the fact that through my frontline work I see, and I'm glad that Trish actually brought up that video about the disability issue, but I also see welfare workers being the agents of the state, using every effort that they have to minimize and block incomes for housing portions, or they would call child protection services on mothers, or they would constantly blame the poor and refuse payments as minuscule as they could. Fighting for a radical welfare reform, to me, is something I'm not opposed to. However, I don't believe the agents of the state actually have our interests at heart, which is why I'm open to the idea of a guaranteed income and fighting for 100% of what we want instead.
Okay, thank you. And the third question.
Hello. I'm Simon. I'm a member of Socialist Alternative Vancouver. So, can't hear me. Oh. My name is Simon.
Better.
I'm a member of Socialist Alternative Vancouver. So, if we accept that any left demand must have at least as a significant side effect an increase in political power for the working class, both in terms of independence from capital and experience and ability to struggle as a class. Is there any even utopian version of basic income that would do that? And I don't remember anyone on the panel's name, but you compared fighting for basic income to fighting for universal health care, and I think there is a case that universal health care does that, but I worry that there's like a kind of fundamental difference between universal health care or other social services and universal basic income. So maybe to put this another way, at the end of the Communist Manifesto, right before Marx says workers of the world unite, he says something, I'm paraphrasing, like communists, wherever they are, always raise the property question, whatever its level of development. Is there any way that a basic income meets that criteria?
Okay, thanks. All right, so go ahead. We'll start with John, and then if other panelists would like to weigh in, but we'd really like to keep the audience engaged.
Okay. Well, unless the other panelists would like to take it, because I'm already going to respond to them, so maybe
Yeah, go ahead, if you like.
No? Okay. Well, on the inflation question, yes, there has been one of the issues that has been raised by critics of basic income is that to simply provide cash payment without other forms of controls does indeed run that possibility. It's particularly raised around questions of rents, without very effective rent controls, if people are...
Can you speak closer to the mic?
I'm sorry. Without very effective rent controls, for example, if there were an additional payment, that's assuming people are getting more money, then there is a risk. There is a risk of just inflating the rents, and that has been raised. When it comes to the question of specifically it was raised welfare workers playing acting as cops. There is a police function that is involved to the job that welfare workers do, and I came here to argue that they were looking to redefine the neoliberal agenda through something called basic income. But believe me, I didn't come here to stump for the social assistance system as a system of justice. It is entirely, as I tried to point out when I analysed its functions and its roots, it is a highly oppressive system and needs to be challenged in a million ways. But I don't believe that providing a cash payment that is also a top-up and a subsidy to low-wage employers that is introduced in a climate of austerity and privatisation that fuels that is going to provide a meaningful answer. But I have to say, the people that I have the most sympathy for who advocate for basic income are the people who are actually directly affected by social assistance, who've concluded that anything must be better than this. I think they're wrong, but I respect their opinion enormously. I think with regards to the utopian aspect, that's perhaps the problem with basic income, that it is in reality a neoliberal ploy in how it would be introduced, but it offers a utopian vision without offering any real, in my view, practical advances for strengthening the position of the working class in general or the poor in particular.
Right. The panelists want to quickly address these questions?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind talking about the hyperinflation concern. I can't recall who brought that up. When I looked at the various pilots programs that have been conducted, particularly Manitoba's MinCom, and granted there were comments to the fact that these are probably not truly representative because of their small size, but there wasn't a lot of evidence actually in those programs for significant inflation. And there's also the concept of when income is granted to people who have had lower income and perhaps had not even enough funds to buy basic necessities, that they have something called a higher marginal propensity to consume. So the new additional dollars they get in, they tend to spend it right away instead of saving it. So they build up effective demand, which tends to reduce the tendency to higher inflation as well too. So.
All right. Any other panelists who'd like to respond to any of those questions? No? No? Mikhail?
No, just to hammer on the point. I mean, I think John took the point of the agents of the state, and I completely share that. I mean, I think the same sort of the same feeling towards that being like the place where I really get those arguments. I think it's a hard. I think that's just a hard question. I think the welfare systems we have are terrible and oppressive. But I think it's just the point. And in terms of you saying that you were also anti-capitalist, right? It's that recognition that unfortunately, as John pointed out, that unemployment, poverty, homelessness, all of that has that political function in capitalism, and that function is to show people here's the alternative. Right, and that's the same thing that the poor laws and the whole way the welfare system has been built up over centuries has been intended to show. Enough to stave off the pitchforks completely, but also not enough so that others are constantly being reminded of what happens when you don't play along.
So, John, I obviously said you can address each of the panelists, but if you want to inflect your comments more towards those who are more sympathetic on the panel towards basic income, that would also make sense. I mean, just to sort of address the positions that stand a little bit more opposed to yours, if you like. And then we'll go back to the audience and take another 3 questions.
I mean, I think there are sort of a couple of themes that I'd like to to talk about. In outlining what a progressive basic income would look like, if it were possible, and that's the disagreement, of course, is over possibility. One of the things that was stressed was the notion of what it would mean to provide that adequate payment. In terms, it would give people increased bargaining power. There is no question that if you provide people with an amount that enables them to, as was defined, have their basic needs, live with dignity, and that exists by virtue of that payment, there is no question that would change this society very, very profoundly. But I again come back to the point that 40 years into a neoliberal agenda with relatively weak trade unions, the prospect for winning such a gain and removing the element of economic coercion from this system are just not very stellar. And in fact, if it all comes down to the adequacy, if the payment that is given is miserable and inadequate and is given to low-wage workers, then what you are doing is creating a situation where low-wage workers now rely on a payment that comes from the tax base in order to reach a basic standard of living. You have to ask yourself, what does that do to the fight for 15? What does that do to people struggling for increased minimum wages or challenging low-wage employers? It weakens it. It weakens it. It drives it down. I mean, anyone's familiar with the Speenhamland situation in England in 1797 when they topped the agricultural workers' wages up out of the poor laws to a miserable degree. It depressed wages. And that's what would, I think, unfold with an inadequate payment, and an inadequate payment is much more likely. I'd also, again, like to stress that that providing focusing on cash payment rather than strengthening of services actually lends itself so much to an austerity agenda because of the simplicity of removing it. All you got to do is cut it. It's very, very simple and very, very straightforward. A Facebook friend that I have in Derby in England was talking about some of the British proposals. And what she talked about was how difficult it had been over an extended period for the austerity agenda in the UK to dismantle and weaken the welfare state because of what she called it the beverageisation of the welfare state. Beverage was the same kind of figure that Leonard Marsh was here. And but it was a complex, multifaceted system of social provision, and dismantling it was difficult even for Margaret Thatcher. But if it was just a cash payment, then boom, 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 it's gone like that. So a basic income system that relies on the cash payment is so weak from that point of view. And the final thing I'd just like to respond to is the question of technological displacement. It is only because we live in a profit-driven system that we agonise about technological displacement. What we're actually talking about is increasing the productivity of human labour through technology. And provided that was done in a sustainable fashion, that would actually be a benefit in a rational society. But in this society, it hurts people. And it hurts people because of how it's introduced. Capitalists who are in competition with each other use these gains in order to lay off workers, in order to reduce the bargaining power of the workers they still have, and that's how they're going to do it. And Elon Musk, the big advocate of a basic income, he's a greasy little union buster. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, there is absolutely no way that people like him are going to allow for this adequate basic income to come into place to protect us from the workers' future. The workless future. They're gonna throw people out. And finally, just let me say that the term emancipation comes up, the emancipatory quality. I believe in emancipation. I'm a socialist. I believe in getting rid of the capitalist system. But I believe we're going to win emancipation through social transformation and not through social policy. And that's the reality of it.
All right, thank you. I believe Elon Musk is promising frozen yogurt rather than unions. So he's giving something, right?
Almost the same thing.
Almost. So try and be concise.
I try to be as short as possible. I have 4 questions. I try to make short as very quick. My name is Solomon. Okay. The question is, before I ask the question is, are we the right place? For example, assuming I have a bladder problem, but I go instead of a urologist, I go to an ophthalmologist. So the doctor says, I am an eye doctor, I'm not the bladder doctor, I cannot help you. So you are a doctor. Are we the right place? These panelists can answer the question. What is the question? The question is, as a worker, as a laborer, how much is my income per month in BC? $3,000, $2,500, $15 an hour times 40 hours a week will become 600 times 4. How much tax I have to pay to CRA? How much should I pay for my rental unit? How much should I pay for transportation? How much should I pay for my lunch, dinner, and breakfast? I don't think 3,000 will be enough. However, many people, they don't get even 2,000 or 2,500. So, how much is basic income? Okay, what's basic income? Is it a minimum wage, which is not minimum to just be alive, to continue the next day to work as a laborer? If the capitalist has a mind, has a brain, they can feed me to provide me for the next day labor. But there is so much labor, the Marx says the unemployment army, they don't need labor. So they can go to welfare for $710, which is, it's nothing. Don't talk about retirement plan, don't talk about those guys 1 year waiting for something and there is no answer from the government. You mentioned about employment, unemployment and insurance and welfare, etc. Okay, why Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan tried to cut off? This is the question for John. I know why. Because of the Russian collapse, okay, there was no more harm. And last question, do you believe capitalism is the end of it, means the end of his life, there is no more progress plans after 40 years of the neoliberalism? What is next?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Next question, please.
Hi. So my question is more just about the numbers of universal basic income. So the napkin calculation looks like, as was mentioned, about 30% of GDP, which is somewhere between $200 and $400 billion to implement like a real universal basic income. To put that in perspective, the national budget of Canada in 2017 was about $300 billion. So we're talking about doubling the entire national budget. And I was just wondering, from your perspective, from the supporters of universal basic income, where is this money supposed to come from? And why isn't that just a non-starter?
Okay, thank you. I think we'll take 2 more.
Hi. I think my question was more towards Jenna, who is advocating and working directly within Canada. Here within Canada, right now, why would we be advocating for universal basic income versus raising our minimum wage? Like, instead of having that subsidize our minimum wage to a livable wage, what are the benefits of advocating for that versus advocating for a better minimum wage with more tax money to go around for social services?
Good. And 4th, and then we'll go back.
Hi there, my question is for anyone on the panel.
Yeah.
My question is for anyone on the panel. Who pays for the universal basic income and how is it paid?
Okay, thank you. So, back to the panel.
Can I? Sorry.
Sure.
Okay. So I want to deal with.
And also make sure you.
I want to deal with the question raised on the cost and also the payment. So I agree, 30% of GDP is enormous.
Duane, make sure you're speaking into the.
Oh, sorry. So my view of this is that because of this, it probably has to be a staged approach. We can't, in other words, I don't think, dive into a fully blown, fully progressive basic income scheme immediately for those reasons. In terms of who pays, there's been a lot of talk about the different ways that we could possibly pay. Yanis Varoufakis suggested, for example, a capital transaction tax that would be a tax on all initial public offerings in the public market. A wealth tax, so some sort of tax on wealth, could be in the form of inheritance tax, different property taxes. Also a scrip tax, which is a tax on public companies' assets or its equity. There could be, for example, government data transfer tax. So all of those companies that use government data or data that we as citizens provide for companies like Facebook and Amazon for free, basically. There could be a tax on that. We could also make use of Pigouvian taxes. Those are the tax activities that are generally have negative externalities. And we already have one of those, at least in BC, carbon tax. We tax on tobacco, alcohol. And then there's also the semi-nationalization of industry, so the state perhaps owns some percentage of shares in public companies and builds up a sovereign wealth fund from dividends. So those are all some, in addition to the usual progressive income tax, those are all some ideas anyways.
Yeah,
Please
Thank you.
come in. Yeah. Those are all great questions. So first to address the question, why not fight for an increased minimum wage and why a basic income instead, I'll say that a minimum wage only helps people who are working. And I think there are many people in our society who are doing unpaid labor right now that deserves to be valued and is valuable. And I think that it's very interesting that if you send your child to somebody else to be cared for, that person would get paid minimum wage. But if you choose to care for your child yourself, then you wouldn't also deserve a livable income for that work, that really important, valuable work that invests in children and prepares them for the future. But I also will, again, stress it's not either or. I will always fight for increased wages as well. And I think that the argument that if you are arguing for a basic income, then it reduces your power to argue for other things. I think you could say that about most social policies, that if you're asking the government for one thing, it's hard to also present other cases. And so I would say that I don't think that that's a unique problem of universal basic income, although I recognize the ask is bigger than perhaps some of the other asks. On that note, the money, I agree with some of the suggestions that were put forward. There are multiple ways to fund a basic income that you will see out there if you poke around at what other people have suggested. The Basic Income Canada Network right now is going through a modeling process with policy experts and economists and people who are working and living through these experiences, a team of experts. And so we're going to have a policy document very soon that outlines exactly how it would be funded through restructuring the income tax system. And I also will say that as somebody with a PhD in public health, I think that when we invest in people, when we invest in the social determinants of health and provide people with enough income to live dignified lives, then we see a lot of reductions in problems that come later on. And that's partially why I'm more for a basic income. If it is an either or, I am more for basic income than universal basic services, because I believe that the flexibility offered by income allows people to make those decisions for themselves. So I don't have to apply for housing and then childcare. And then, I do support a system that has all of these social policies in it together. But I think universal basic services for example, and just relying on existing social services forces people to, number one, deal with problems after they already happen, rather than preventing them to begin with a livable income. And then number two, I think it also forces people to access separate and likely insufficient systems. So I think that the power and flexibility of income is powerful, and that's why I personally believe in basic income. I think those were most of the questions for me. Oh, and who would pay for it? Well, no, that's enough. Go ahead. Somebody else.
Okay. Trish and John?
If I could, I'd actually like to focus on the make the rich pay sort of element of the thing that just came up. And so, yes, we agree that a full universal basic income is going to be pretty massive in terms of cost. And so the notion is that various things can be done to make the wealthy pay the share. And pay up for it. And Yanis Varoufakis is actually he's the former Syriza finance minister in Greece. He actually has made arguments around the basic income that I find particularly intriguing in this regard, because what he argues is that that the old ways of redistributing income by making the better paying section of the working class pay more to keep the poorest section of the working class up is no longer possible because neoliberalism has done so much damage. And then he says you're not going to get the capitalists to redistribute income between labour and capital because they become so mean and vicious under neoliberalism that's not possible. So what you're going to do is set up basic income, which is going to civilise capitalism, as he puts it. But I don't understand quite why the capitalists don't want to redistribute income, but somehow this basic income system is just going to convince them that that's what they should do. It's going to transform them. It has this sort of like pacifying, civilising effect. And I mean, to suggest in the present climate that we are going to reverse the incredible free ride of the rich just because we declare basic income. I mean, I believe the rich should pay far more taxes. In fact, I don't believe the rich should be rich. But the notion that we are on the cusp of having the political ability to reverse decades of regressive tax direction just because we set up basic income, I don't see the basis for that. I don't see where that comes from. So I think that again it's another example of how advocacy for basic income with the greatest of intentions loses sight of the actual context and political reality and political agenda that we're up against.
So we're coming to the end of our time, so I think we need to just answer, Mikhail, if you have any words, Trish, and then we'll have to wrap. We're being told we have to finish.
Just one more number to toss out there, that 30% of GDP is roughly the entire profit share of the economy. 70% roughly is the labor share, 30% is the profit share. So unless we're, as John says, redistributing between sectors of the working class, that's hard. And in terms of, I think the Varoufakis proposal is kind of intriguing, and there's this kind of universal dividend. But we have to remember last time this was seriously tried sort of in the 1970s in Sweden under the Meidner plan, which got watered down and then completely kiboshed. And that was at sort of the height of social democratic government and a strong labor movement. The sort of height of the welfare state, where that was the point when workers could start really trying to eat into that profit share. And even then it was difficult to do and proved ultimately unfeasible. And looking at places like Norway or Alaska currently, which have these big sovereign wealth funds, the payments that are made there to Norway doesn't pay out, it just reinvests and then pays out a little bit to the state budget. In Alaska, it's hundreds of dollars a year. And again, it just shows, the sort of disconnect between the ideas and then the actual numbers and the economics behind it. And one other place where I see that disconnect is in terms of the automation stuff. I mean, we're currently, for the last decade, we've had the lowest productivity growth since statistics have been basically kept. So again, this sort of mass wave of automation, at least currently, is nowhere to be seen. In fact, as John said, there's less pressure for capitalists to innovate and create labor-saving devices because labor is weak.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'll keep it very brief. I know people want to go home. I thought it was interesting that Jenna used the example of the comparison of basic income to universal healthcare, because that's actually a ploy that we make as well. We compare public healthcare to public poverty reduction. Just as we collectively take care of each other, pay taxes, and have this universal healthcare system, why shouldn't we do that for universal poverty reduction? So I think there's something in there, like which is closer, universal basic income or universal basic services, which is basically what a poverty reduction plan is. And I think maybe Simon's question on this got to the heart of it, which is what I will mull over, is, which position takes us further in increasing the political power of the working class, of people in poverty, and strengthening that as a movement, and which does not.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, I'm not so sure people are dying to get home, but unfortunately we have to bring this to a close. So on behalf of our partners, SFU Public Square, Van City Office for Community Engagement and Labor Studies Program, on behalf of the Institute for the Humanities, I'd like to thank our panelists, especially a big thank you for John Clarke and the terrific lecture he gave. But also, I think that we have we've had on this panel a force field of positions, and I think this is really important. I want to emphasize how important it is to have a diversity of perspectives that don't agree and that engage in some degree of back and forth. It's really important in the university to maintain this spirit.